Peace, and welcome to Oddly Familiar. Today, we will be taking a look at 10 submissions from our viewers. But let's not waste any more time. Here is Oddly Familiar, a viewer special. The first up is the only one on this list that I knew about, but it's still a viewer submission. Here is the ending to ActRaiser on the SNES. Now let's compare that to the 20th Century Fox intro. Submitted by a return viewer, Retro Collector 89 brought this one up. I figured it's a good one for the first entry on our list because it's a good introduction jingle. ActRaiser was released on December 16th of 1990, and the soundtrack was composed by Yuzo Koshiro, one of our favorite composers around here, and a return composer to Oddly Familiar. Number 9 is from Fatal Fury 3, the theme of Terry Bogard. Sung by Bobby Kimball, by the band Toto, here is Goodbye Eleanor. Submitted by Ricardo Mauricio Araya. I would agree, the Fatal Fury 3 song does seem to take inspiration. I wouldn't say plagiarism, but that's the good part about this series. It doesn't have to be exact, just familiar. Fatal Fury 3 was released on March 27th of 1995, and the soundtrack was composed by Takashi Nishiyama. Up next is the underground theme from the NES game King's Knight. If you didn't hear it, try the Twilight Zone. This one comes from a viewer named Mr. Chiselblast. King's Knight first came out in Japan in 1986 on September 18th, and the soundtrack was composed by none other than Nobuo Uematsu, the same composer that many people know from Final Fantasy. This is only the third soundtrack he composed, almost a full year before any Final Fantasy game. Lucky number 7 comes from the Tekken arcade game, a track named King George Island. Coming from the Wiz soundtrack, here is the Emerald City Sequence by Quincy Jones. Thanks to Super Kokujin 916 for this one. I think the bass line has a familiar ring to it. The Tekken version is sped up. It's not a sample, but it does sound like it was replayed, at least in my opinion. The Tekken arcade game was released in 1994, with the soundtrack being composed by Yoshie Arakawa. Tekken is one of my favorite fighting game franchises. However, I didn't play the arcade version that much. Our number 6 spot is from Double Dragon, a song titled Travel. New challenge. And now, the band Golden Earring and their song named Radar Love. This one comes from a viewer named Spiffmeister Z, and I do see what they mean. It's not exact, but that bass line has a familiar ring to it. And it may be a common riff, but it could be inspired. Composed by Kazunaka Yamane and released in 1987, Double Dragon is considered to be the first successful beat-em-up game, spawning multiple sequels that have been featured on and ported to over 20 different consoles, including the NES, SNES, Game Boy, Sega Master System, Sega Genesis, and many more. Number 5 comes from the Commodore 64, a game titled Commando 86. This one has appeared in Oddly Familiar before. Here is Tubular Bells from The Exorcist. Thank you to N2144 for bringing this one to my attention. This one is undoubtedly similar. I don't have a ton of experience with the Commodore 64. I didn't grow up with one. The first console I ever owned was an NES. The reason why I bring this up is the fact I am relying on you guys for Commodore submissions. And to be honest, I would like to do an episode on just the Commodore 64. So please comment with some more. Moving on to number 4, here is the Stage 4 theme from Donkey Kong Jr. And here is I Will Follow Him by Peggy March. Released on January 22nd of 1963 and submitted by Rob Morris in September of 2018, thank you for the entry. Donkey Kong Jr. is an arcade platformer that was released in 1982, developed by Nintendo R&D 1, the same team that developed many popular games, including Kid Icarus, Metroid, Kung Fu, and even Excitebike. The music in Donkey Kong Jr. was composed by Yukio Kaneoka, who was a member of Nintendo R&D 2, and was a mentor to one of the most popular video game music developers that has ever worked for Nintendo, Mr. Koji Kondo. The bronze position, number 3, comes from Pilot Wing 64, Birdman. And here is the Beatles, Free as a Bird. For the second time in our series, we have an entry from Guru Larry. So thank you for the submission. The Beatles are one of the most well-known rock bands of all time, there is no doubting that, and their first album was released in 1963. So now, just considering these facts, it's no surprise they have influenced so many composers, producers, singers, and rock bands alike. Pilot Wings was released in 1996 besides PAL Regions, which received it in 1997. The soundtrack was composed by Dan Hess. Mr. Hess only composed for one other video game soundtrack before leaving the industry for good, and that was F1 World Grand Prix, also for the Nintendo 64. It's a shame he didn't stick around for longer because the Pilot Wing 64 soundtrack is quite good. In at number 2, we have Aerobiz Supersonic for the Super Nintendo, the North American theme. Let's compare that to Eric Clapton, Tears in Heaven.
Would you know my name?
Submitted by Jutely311, and sorry if I pronounced that wrong. This is probably the most similar one in the entire series so far, and I'm surprised only one person has submitted this, so I had to put it high on the list. The Eric Clapton song was released in 1991 in the movie Rush, but it wasn't made available until the soundtrack came out in 1992, and it won 3 Grammys in 1993. I'm only saying all of this to point out the fact that Aerobiz Supersonic was released in 1993 as well. The North American theme was composed by Taku Iwasaki, who I think most people would know from composing for anime. He composed one of my favorite anime soundtracks of all time, the Kenshin OVA. He actually only produced for 8 video games, and 2 of those are Aerobiz. Our top spot comes from Wizards and Warriors, the Invincibility theme. Here is The Who, Baba O'Reilly. This one may not be exact, and it may not even be on purpose, but I like it. So thanks to 7th Angel AD for the submission. We have been in a Wizards and Warriors mood around here, so this just fits right in. Composed by David Wise, the soundtrack to this game makes playing the game worth it. The game is good, but this soundtrack makes the game great. A bad soundtrack doesn't always ruin a game. You can turn off the music or just mute the TV, but a soundtrack like this makes you want to play more and hear more. So first things first, I want to thank everyone who submits oddly familiar songs. An episode like this would not exist without all of you. There are a ton of submissions, but I can't fit all of them into one episode, and some of them I don't hear the similarities, so I will have to go back and listen again. One of the best ways to submit something is to write the timestamp of the part that is oddly familiar. This would drastically improve the chances of me catching the similarity and in turn, improve the chance of the submission making an episode. I try to show the first comment of the submission, but if you submitted one before someone else and I put their comment instead of yours, then I do apologize. I didn't do it on purpose. Another thing, I may not credit people if I already knew about the submission. I do have a long list of songs that I have not made it to yet. Last but not least, we did start a Patreon, so if you would like to show some support, you can find the link below. You can help out for as low as $1 a month. Anyways, I'm ICC. Thanks for watching. Peace.